All right, so today we are going to be looking at intervals, and if you've already gone through parts 1 and 2 with me, you should know that we have so far focused on the scales of C major and A minor and the chords in both. Now we are going to look at intervals today, which can be defined as the distance between one note to another note, and all of the following examples I'm going to use will be rooted on C. Now I'm going to do the usual thing where I show you a few diagrams and play the examples through the speakers, and it's probably best you should still be taking notes, and even better if you have a keyboard or even just a guitar, you can sit there and play along with me as I explain each example interval by interval. Okay. Now, intervals are an important thing to understand early on because they serve a very important purpose in your ability to train your ears. Now, what that means essentially is it's basically just a way to improve your listening capabilities. And when you hear music, you'll be able to identify melodies better, you'll be able to work them out on your instrument more quickly and precisely. And you'll basically just have a better feel for understanding and grasping these individual building blocks of music and using them to write your own songs, cover other people's. The sky's the limit, really. But that means first understanding the relationship that one note has to another. And that starts by just sitting down like we are and working this all out on paper and basically just practicing these little methods and these systems to get them into your head well enough to the point where you know what you're doing. So before we start on intervals, we're going to have to look at the notes or the tones individually. And this is a crucial part of understanding how intervals work. If you want to grasp intervals, you've first got to look at each of the 12 notes in the 12-tone scale, which is what we are going to look at to start with, which is this little chart I've outlined for you below, numbered 1 to 12. Now, we've only worked with vanilla C major up to this point, and what we are going to do today is introduce the concept of sharp and flat notes. Now, we dealt with this a little bit last time around when we were going through chord construction, but this is the lesson where we really start to understand what they are and how they can be used. Now, check out the little diagram I've put at the bottom of my piano keyboard, and you will see that the sharp/flat notes are the black notes. Now, the C major scale is made up of only white notes, and when the black notes get involved, you will be moving outside of the scales of either C major or A minor. And this is where other scales come into play, since all others from this point forward will use one or more black key in their makeup. Now, alternatively, if I were to start from the note, the root in this case, of C major, and play each of these 12 notes in perfect order, then I would be playing a 12-tone scale. And as you might know already, Western music only uses these 12 tones. And when I get to the 13th, I would be back at the octave of C, and the 12 tones would start over again in the same perfect sequence. Now, on piano, a 12-tone scale would sound like this. And that's just the 12 notes being played in a linear order. Now, alternatively, if you took a guitar and played your low E string open, and then played each of the frets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, up to 12, you would also be playing this 12-tone scale, but rooted from E instead of C, and going from the root to the octave through each tone individually. Now, this concept is known as chromaticism, and it basically means playing through each note individually in sequence and not adhering to a scale, shape, or sequence. And because you're not sticking to any specific scale, it tends to have a very out of tune sound. because your brain has this built-in ability to recognize a melody and tends to be drawn to tuneful sounding music rather than just a linear order of notes. Now, alternatively, sticking to a major or minor scale rather than keeping the notes chromatic would be called diatonic, which is what your brain would generally interpret as a tuneful melody. If I were to play only the white notes of the keyboard, thus playing a C major scale, it would be a diatonic scale rather than a chromatic one. And if I wanted to make it chromatic, I would have to include the black keys in this sequence, or the notes in between the steps of the scale. And that brings us to the intervals themselves. So as I've explained already, an interval is essentially the distance between one note and another note. And if we were to go from the root of C, for example, which all the following examples will be based off, to any other note in the scale, that would be a particular interval. So C to C sharp or D flat, I'll get into that in a minute. But from C to C sharp, or C to D, or C to E or F, then that would be a particular interval, of which there are 13 kinds. Each of them either fall into the category of unison, minor, major, diminished, or perfect. And we're going to go through each one chronologically, as well as look at a couple of kinds of systems you can use to analyze and understand how intervals work together. Now, for me to just cycle through the list one by one and explain each interval and its properties is not a very helpful way of getting this down, which is where the method comes in. This chart here is more for reference and to give you an idea of the distance from the root note to the target interval. So if we spend just a second on this part, hopefully you'll come away with a pretty grounded understanding of how these intervals basically function. So we'll start with unison. If I were to play the C note twice like this, then I would be playing a unison interval, which is essentially beginning on one note and playing that note again, not having moved to another. Now, if I play the C note and I move to a C sharp note like this, then I'm now playing a minor second interval, which in this case would go from C to C sharp. So this next part is probably the most important thing you need to grasp when working with intervals. Now I know all of these examples are in C, but if the notes change, the intervals don't. So if we were to go from C sharp to D, for example, that would be a minor second. It would not be in the key of C major anymore, but the interval has not changed. It's the same distance between notes, whether we're going from C to C sharp or C sharp to D or E to F. Each of these examples are minor seconds because they only move by a semitone each time. All possible intervals that can occur all take place within the 12-tone system, like we've gone over already. So any notes you're hearing are one or more of the 12 tones. The other thing you've probably worked out already, but sharps and flats are synonymous. So C sharp would be the same note as D flat, and this will make more sense once we get into the music reading and writing parts of this course. You have your sharp keys and your flat keys, which contain sharps and flats respectively, and you don't get sharps and flats in the same key. Keys either feature sharp notes or flat notes or none at all. But for now, all you need to really understand is each sharp has an equivalent flat and vice versa. And you might just want to spend a bit of time checking out that piano diagram and memorizing which ones are which. So thanks for bearing with me there. I know that part was extremely dry, but it's important to grasp this stuff before we work out how to apply it, which we are going to do right now. What really makes this work is the referencing system, I'm going to call it, which is where you memorize a section of a song which features the target interval very heavily. And what I'm going to do now is pull up this chart, which consists of my own reference tracks that I have used to memorize specific intervals and get a feel for how they sound and where they crop up. Now, if this seems confusing, just let me explain it a little more in some simpler terms. Now, the minor second is an interval that features very heavily in John Williams' Jaws theme. Now, if you picture that melody in your head for a second, you will probably pull up the da-dun, da-dun motif that he uses throughout the song. And this is a minor second. Dun, dun. The distance between those two notes forms a minor second. And you can use this referencing system to help you memorize each kind of interval. Let's just pick another example at random. So the perfect fourth features very heavily in the wedding song, Here Comes the Bride. So dun, 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 that dun, dun is a perfect fourth interval. You see what I mean? We can keep going with this. The diminished fifth features very heavily at the start of the Simpsons theme. The Simpsons, those first two notes form a diminished fifth. You could also use Rush's track YYZ, which starts with the dun 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 riff. That is a diminished fifth. That's a very clear example of a diminished fifth. So you can use any song you want to try and get these down. You need to find one example per interval, so 13 examples to memorize in total. And it's best that you do this yourself and you have your own chart like I do, which features an example for each interval to help you memorize these. Now, if you check out the description, I've put up 2 links, and the first is to a guy called Teague Christie, who teaches you this reference system on piano in real time. And he does it in a much more relaxed way than I do. This is more of a hard theory look at how intervals operate and precisely what they mean. But that video of his was the one I came across many years ago, and it was the way I originally learned how to memorize my intervals. So if you check out both of our videos, then hopefully you'll have the best of both worlds. You'll have an understanding of how the intervals operate from a theory standpoint, as well as a more fun way to just get them down through his system that he teaches, that I have heavily borrowed from here. Now, the second link is to a site called Earbeater, which is an ear training website which features exercises on how to train your ears to recognize intervals, chords, and scales. And this is also another site that's been indispensable to me memorizing all of this. So I recommend that you start with the basic intervals first, like we're doing here, and like we would do with the first link, but you can use that as a jumping off point and train your ears to recognize chords, scales, everything. And this is something that we are going to be looking at in a future video, but for now we will stick to the bread and butter intervals. Now that's about it, but I'm going to leave you with a task. So if you do own a piano, I want you to sit down, check out the keyboard diagram I have provided below, and using the chart, play through each interval unison to octave, play them multiple times apart and together, cycle through them one by one, get a feel for the distance between them and the notes that they use to achieve their specific intervals. If you are solely a guitarist or bass player, then grab your instrument and starting from the low E, I want you to play the open note and then fret a fret, going chronologically from fret 1, 2, 3, 4 up to fret 12 at the octave. This works the same way, and I want you to use this same system to find each of the 13 intervals on the neck and get a feel for how they operate. It can be applied to both the piano and the guitar. I hope you learned a lot, and take it easy.